Across the galaxy, they were known as the Chosen. Masters of technology so advanced it seemed like magic. Conquerors who had never faced defeat in 10,000 years of expansion. Their empires stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, and every species that encountered them either knelt in submission or ceased to exist entirely. But something happened when they reached Sol 3, something unprecedented in their long history of conquest. They came with their usual confidence, their fleets darkening Earth's skies, their ultimatum transmitted in every human language: surrender or perish. What followed changed everything. The Chosen didn't retreat. They didn't negotiate. They didn't even leave behind wreckage or bodies. They simply vanished. No distres signals. No final transmissions. No trace of their massive fleets that had arrived with such overwhelming force. One day they were there, preparing to add another world to their endless empire. The next day, it was as if they had never existed at all. The galaxy trembled with questions. What could make the mighty Chosen disappear without a trace? What force could erase beings so powerful that they had reshaped the very laws of physics to suit their will? The answer lay not in humanity's weapons or technology, but in something far more terrifying to a species that believed itself chosen by the universe itself. Something that would make them question everything they thought they knew about conquest, about superiority, and about what it truly meant to be human. This is the story of what the Chosen discovered when they tried to claim Earth. This is the story of why they vanished. And this is the story of what humanity really is when pushed to the absolute edge of extinction. The first sign wasn't the ships. It wasn't the electromagnetic pulses that knocked out satellites across 3 continents, or the way every radio telescope on Earth suddenly went silent. The first sign was the birds. They fell from the sky in perfect silence, not dead, but sleeping, as if something had simply turned off their ability to remain airborne. Sparrows dropped mid-flight onto busy city streets. Eagles plummeted from mountain peaks. Even the pigeons that had made cities their home for centuries simply folded their wings and fell, creating carpets of feathers across parks and plazas worldwide. Dr. Sarah Chun was monitoring deep space communications at the Arecibo Observatory when the electromagnetic storm hit. She watched her instruments die one by one, screens flickering to black as systems that had operated flawlessly for decades simply ceased to function. But it wasn't random technological failure. Each system shut down in sequence, as if something was methodically testing and then disabling humanity's ability to see beyond their atmosphere. "Ma'am, we're getting reports from Goldstone and Parks," her assistant Marcus called out, his voice tight with confusion. Same thing happening everywhere. Total communication blackout with anything beyond our moon. Sarah stared at her blank screens, a cold understanding settling in her stomach. In 30 years of monitoring space, she had never seen anything like this. The pattern was too deliberate, too coordinated. This wasn't a solar storm or equipment malfunction. Someone was cutting Earth off from the rest of the universe. 3 hours later, they came. The ships materialized in Earth's orbit without any of the dramatic flash that humanity's science fiction had prepared them for. No warp drives, or hyperspace exits, or dimensional tears. One moment the space around Earth was empty, and the next moment it wasn't. Massive structures simply existed where nothing had been before, as if reality itself had been rewritten to include them. There were 12 ships, each one the size of Manhattan, arranged in perfect geometric formation around Earth. They were beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly, their surfaces shifting between colors that human eyes weren't designed to perceive. The ships didn't orbit or move in any conventional sense. They simply held position, as motionless as mountains, their presence warping light around them in patterns that made physicists around the world question everything they thought they understood about space and gravity. President Morrison was in the Situation Room when the ships appeared. The massive screens that normally displayed global intelligence data now showed only static and error messages. Every military satellite, every spy network, every communication system designed to keep humanity connected had been rendered useless. They were blind and deaf, cut off from their own technology by forces they couldn't begin to understand. How many people are we talking about? Morrison asked his advisors, though he knew the question was meaningless. How do you count the crew of ships that shouldn't be able to exist? General Patricia Hayes, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, studied the few operational ground-based telescopes they still had access to. Unknown, sir. We can't get close enough readings to determine anything about their composition or crew size. For all we know, those ships could be automated, or they could each hold millions of beings. Defense Secretary Williams leaned forward, his face pale. Sir, we need to discuss our response options. Do we attempt communication? Do we prepare for defensive action? Morrison looked around the room at the faces of the most powerful people in the American government and saw his own helplessness reflected in their expressions. What defensive action? Against ships that can appear out of nowhere and disable our entire communication network without us even knowing how? We're not dealing with an invasion force we can understand. We're dealing with something so far beyond our capabilities that we might as well be throwing rocks at hurricanes. The president was right, though he didn't yet understand how right. The beings aboard those ships had been conquering worlds for over 10,000 years. They called themselves the Chosen, and they had earned that name through absolute dominance over every form of life they had encountered. Their technology had advanced beyond the physical limitations that bound lesser species. They could manipulate matter at the subatomic level, bend space and time to their will, and their weapons could sterilize entire planets with the casual ease of turning off a light switch. Aboard the lead ship, Supreme Commander Valex observed Earth with the detached interest of an expert examining a particularly simple puzzle. The planet was unremarkable in most ways. Standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, abundant liquid water, a single moon, typical carbon-based life forms. The dominant species showed signs of early technological development, but nothing that would pose even the slightest challenge to Chosen superiority. Valex's second-in-command, tactical coordinator Zenth, materialized beside him in the observation chamber. The Chosen had long ago transcended the need for physical bodies, though they maintained forms that were pleasing to their aesthetic sensibilities. Zenth appeared as a tall, elegant figure composed of shifting geometric patterns that somehow conveyed both grace and deadly purpose. Initial scans complete, Supreme Commander, Zenth reported. The species calls itself human. Population approximately 8 billion individuals. Their technology is primitive, roughly equivalent to what the Corthani achieved before we absorbed them 3 millennia ago. Their weapons are chemical-based projectiles and fusion devices. They have achieved basic space flight, but have not yet established permanent colonies beyond their planet. Valex nodded, unsurprised. It was always the same. Young civilizations developed along predictable paths, and humanity appeared to be following the standard pattern. Resistance capability? Negligible, Zenth replied. Their most powerful weapons could barely scratch our defensive screens. Their space-based infrastructure has been neutralized. They are currently operating with primitive ground-based systems only. Time to full conquest. Zenth consulted data streams that flowed directly into his consciousness. Standard protocol suggests 48 hours for complete pacification. The species appears to have significant cultural diversity and no unified command structure, which should accelerate the collapse once we demonstrate our capabilities. Valex moved to the control interface, a construct of pure thought and energy that responded to his intentions before he could fully form them. This was how it always began. Quick, clean, overwhelming demonstration of power, followed by the species' inevitable surrender and integration into the Chosen Empire. They had performed this ritual of conquest so many times that it had become routine. But as Valex prepared to initiate first contact protocols, something unusual happened. The ship's consciousness, a vast artificial intelligence that had been built by the first generation of Chosen millennia ago, sent him a subtle warning pulse. Clarification required. The ship's mind communicated. Anomalous readings detected. Valex paused, his attention sharpening. In 10,000 years of conquest, the ship minds had never reported anything truly anomalous. They had encountered species with unusual biology, strange technology, even a few races with primitive psychic abilities. But nothing that the ship's vast computational power couldn't analyze and categorize within moments. Specify nature of anomaly, Valex commanded. Unable to specify, the ship responded, and for the first time in centuries, Valex felt something approaching surprise. The ship minds were incapable of uncertainty. They were designed to process any form of matter or energy that existed within known physical laws. The fact that this ship was reporting something it couldn't categorize suggested they were dealing with something unprecedented. Continue with standard first contact protocol, Valx decided. Monitor anomalous readings and report any changes. Down on Earth, Sarachon was one of the first to detect the transmission. With most of their sophisticated equipment offline, she had resorted to a simple radio telescope from the 1970s, a relic that the electromagnetic interference had somehow missed. When the signal came through, it was impossibly clear, as if it was being transmitted directly into her equipment without passing through any medium at all. The message was simple and appeared simultaneously in every human language that had ever been spoken or written. It bypassed radio waves entirely, appearing directly on every screen, every display, every surface capable of showing information. It manifested in the minds of blind individuals as perfectly clear speech, and in the minds of deaf individuals as perfectly legible text. People of Earth, the message began, and somehow every human being on the planet heard it in their own voice, as if they were speaking the words to themselves. You are being contacted by the chosen, rightful inheritors of this galaxy and all life within it. Your species has reached a level of development that requires integration into our empire. The words continued, but Sarah found herself focusing not on their content, but on their impossibility. How is this message reaching everyone simultaneously? How is it translating itself perfectly into languages that have been dead for thousands of years? How is it appearing in the minds of people who were asleep, waking them with perfect clarity about what they had heard? Your world will be incorporated into the chosen sphere within 48 hours, the message continued. Resistance will result in the complete sterilization of your planet and the extinction of your species. Cooperation will result in your civilization's continued existence under chosen guidance. You will designate representatives to negotiate the terms of your surrender. We will contact your leaders when we are prepared to receive their submission. The message ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving 8 billion human beings in stunned silence. In government buildings and military installations around the world, emergency meetings were called. Religious leaders struggled to provide guidance for a situation that no scripture had ever contemplated. Scientists frantically tried to understand how the message had been delivered using technology that seemed to violate every known law of physics. But in a small apartment in Tokyo, a different conversation was taking place. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a retired professor of anthropology, sat across from his granddaughter Yuki, a quantum physicist who had been working on theoretical applications of consciousness research. "Grandfather," Yuki said quietly, "I don't think they understand what they're dealing with." The old man nodded slowly. He had spent his career studying human civilization, human behavior under extreme stress, and the patterns that emerged when humanity faced existential threats. The message was designed to create fear and helplessness, he said. It assumes that we will respond like every other species they have conquered. But we won't, Yuki said, and it wasn't a question. No, her grandfather agreed. They have made a fundamental error. They believe that superior technology equals superior understanding. They think that because they could disable our satellites and appear in our orbit without warning, they comprehend what humanity is capable of. Yuki looked out her window at the sky, where one of the alien ships hung like a second moon. They're going to learn something they won't like, aren't they? Her grandfather's smile was sad and proud and terrifying all at once. Yes, he said, they are going to discover that there are some things more dangerous than advanced technology. They're going to learn what happens when 8 billion humans decide that death is preferable to surrender. Neither of them knew it yet, but Dr. Tanaka had just identified the exact moment when the Chosen's conquest of Earth began to go catastrophically wrong. The aliens' message had been designed to break humanity's will to resist, but it had accomplished exactly the opposite. Across the planet, in millions of homes and hearts and minds, the same decision was being made simultaneously. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would not negotiate. Humanity would not cooperate. And that decision would soon teach the Chosen why some species vanish not because they're conquered, but because they discover that some victories are too terrible to survive. The Chosen's first demonstration came exactly 12 hours after their ultimatum, timed to occur during peak daylight hours across the most populated regions of Earth. Supreme Commander Valx had selected a target that would provide maximum psychological impact while demonstrating absolute technological superiority. The abandoned city of Pripyat, near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. From Valex's perspective, the choice was tactically perfect. The location was uninhabited, eliminating any immediate loss of human life that might galvanize resistance before surrender could be negotiated. Yet it was historically significant to humanity, representing both their technological failures and their capacity for environmental destruction. Most importantly, it contained enough residual radiation to showcase the Chosen's ability to neutralize the most dangerous effects of human technology. What Valex didn't understand was that he had just selected the one place on Earth that would most perfectly demonstrate why humanity was unlike any species the Chosen had ever encountered. The demonstration began at precisely 1400 hours Greenwich Mean Time. The Chosen ship positioned itself over northern Ukraine and extended what appeared to be a beam of pure silver light toward the abandoned city below. Where the beam touched the ground, radiation levels that had persisted for decades simply ceased to exist. The twisted metal of abandoned vehicles straightened and became pristine. Buildings that had crumbled under years of neglect rebuilt themselves, their walls becoming smooth and unmarked. Within minutes, Pripyat had been transformed from a haunting reminder of nuclear disaster into a gleaming city that looked as if it had been constructed moments before. The radiation was gone. The decay was gone. Even the famous Ferris wheel, rusted and motionless for nearly 40 years, now stood bright and new, turning slowly in the afternoon breeze. But the Chosen had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that healing Pripyat would demonstrate their benevolence and convince humanity that surrender would bring benefits rather than destruction. They had failed to understand that humans don't fear death nearly as much as they fear losing the right to choose their own fate. President Morrison watched the restoration of Pripyat on every available screen in the Situation Room. Satellite feeds showed the impossible transformation in real time, and reports were flooding in from monitoring stations across Europe. Where lethal radiation had existed for decades, there was now nothing but clean air and pristine buildings. Jesus Christ, whispered Defense Secretary Williams. They can actually reverse nuclear contamination. Just like that. In minutes. General Hayes leaned forward, her face grim. Sir, if they can do that to radiation, imagine what they can do to our weapons. Our entire nuclear arsenal could be neutralized before we could even launch it. Morrison nodded slowly, but his expression wasn't one of defeat. It was something far more complicated. They're trying to show us that resistance is futile, he said quietly. They want us to see their power and give up before we even try to fight. Sir, Williams looked confused. Isn't that exactly what we should do? If they can neutralize nuclear weapons and rebuild entire cities in minutes, how can we possibly? Because they don't understand what they're dealing with. Morrison interrupted, and his voice carried a tone that made everyone in the room suddenly pay attention. They think we're afraid of them. They think we'll surrender because they've shown us they're more powerful than we are. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sky where the alien ships hung like dark promises. But they've just made their first mistake. They've shown us that they want to preserve the Earth. They want to keep the infrastructure, the cities, the population. That means they need us alive, and that gives us leverage they don't even realize we have. General Hayes frowned. I'm not sure I follow, sir. Morrison turned back to the room, and the other officials were startled to see something like a smile on his face. It wasn't a pleasant expression. They've just demonstrated that they can fix anything they break, that they can heal any damage they cause, which means we don't have to worry about preserving anything during our resistance. We can break everything, destroy everything, contaminate everything, and they'll just fix it afterwards. The room went silent as the implications sank in. William spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. You're talking about a scorched earth strategy. Complete destruction of everything we've built. I'm talking about making the cost of conquering us so high that they decide it's not worth the effort, Morrison replied. They want to add Earth to their empire because they think we'll be valuable subjects. But what if we make it clear that conquering us will cost them more than leaving us alone? What Morrison didn't know was that across the globe, similar conversations were taking place in government buildings, military installations, and private homes. Humanity was reaching the same conclusion independently, in hundreds of different languages and cultural contexts, but with identical understanding. The Chosen had just shown them that they could heal any wound, fix any damage, reverse any destruction, which meant that humanity was free to fight without worrying about the consequences to their world. In Beijing, Premier Chun watched the reports from Pripyat with his senior advisors. They want us to be grateful, he said quietly. They heal our contaminated city and expect us to thank them for their mercy. General Wu nodded grimly. They don't understand that showing us they can reverse any damage only makes us more dangerous. If they can fix anything we break, then we can break everything without hesitation. In Moscow, President Volkov was having an almost identical conversation. In London, Prime Minister Davies was reaching the same conclusions. In New Delhi, Cairo, Brasilia, and Sydney, the leaders of human civilization were all recognizing the same tactical opportunity. The Chosen had just eliminated humanity's greatest restraint, the fear of destroying their own world in the process of defending it. But the real surprise was yet to come. The response didn't originate from governments or military leaders or international organizations. It came from ordinary people who had watched the restoration of Pripyat and reached their own conclusions about what it meant. Dr. Sarah Chun was monitoring communications when the first report started coming in. With most sophisticated equipment still offline, she was relying on emergency radio networks and word-of-mouth reports from around the world. What she heard made her realize that something unprecedented was happening. "Ma'am," Marcus called out, his voice filled with amazement. "You need to hear this. We're getting reports from everywhere. They're doing something I've never seen before." Sarah put on her headphones and listened to the emergency channels. The reports were scattered and confused, but the pattern was unmistakable. Across the globe, ordinary citizens were taking actions that defied every expectation of how civilian populations respond to overwhelming threats. In Tokyo, office workers were methodically destroying their company's servers and databases before going home to their families. In London, citizens were pouring gasoline on their own cars and setting them ablaze in the streets. In New York, people were throwing furniture and appliances from high-rise apartment buildings, creating massive piles of destroyed possessions in the middle of major intersections. But it wasn't random destruction. It was systematic, purposeful, and almost ritualistic. Families were destroying their own homes. Workers were sabotaging their own businesses. Students were burning their own schools. And they were doing it with a calm determination that was far more unsettling than any panic or hysteria would have been. The reports kept coming in. In Mumbai, an entire shopping district had been systematically demolished by the shop owners themselves. In Sao Paulo, citizens had opened fire hydrants and flooded their own neighborhoods. In Berlin, people were taking hammers to public sculptures and monuments that had stood for centuries. Sarah realized she was witnessing something that had never been documented in human history. An entire species simultaneously deciding to destroy everything they had built rather than allow it to be taken from them. "My God," Marcus whispered. "They're not rioting. They're not panicking. They're just destroying everything they own. Calmly, like they've all decided to do it at exactly the same time." Sarah nodded, understanding flooding through her. They watched the Chosen heal Pripyat. They realized that anything we destroy can be fixed. So they're removing the aliens' incentive to keep us alive. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Sarah explained, her voice growing more confident as she worked through the logic. "The Chosen want to conquer us because they think we'll be useful. Our cities, our infrastructure, our civilization. But if we destroy everything ourselves, what's left for them to conquer? What's the point of ruling over a planet full of people who have nothing left to lose?" As if to prove her point, the radio crackled with a new report. This one came from a small town in Montana, where the entire population had gathered in the main square. They had piled everything they owned in the center of town and set it on fire. Then they had sat down in a circle around the blaze and were simply waiting. "Waiting for what?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked up at the sky, where the alien ships continued their silent vigil. For the Chosen to realize that they've made a terrible mistake. That they've encountered a species that would rather destroy everything they've ever built than surrender their freedom to choose their own fate. Supreme Commander Valex became aware of humanity's response through his ship's monitoring systems. The artificial intelligence reported the destruction in clinical, precise terms, but Valex could sense something like confusion in its data streams. The ship's vast computational power was struggling to create behavioral models for what they were observing. Clarification required. The ship's mind communicated. Species-wide self-destructive behavior detected. Current models indicate 73% probability of complete infrastructure collapse within 48 hours. Revised conquest value assessment requested. Valek studied the incoming data with growing bewilderment. In 10,000 years of conquest, he had never encountered a species that responded to superior force by systematically destroying everything that made them worth conquering. The humans were behaving as if they preferred mutual annihilation to submission, which made no logical sense from an evolutionary perspective. Analysis of behavior patterns, Valek commanded. Multiple theoretical frameworks applied, the ship responded. No adequate explanation for observed behavior. Suggested hypothesis. Species may be experiencing collective psychological break due to overwhelming technological disparity. But Valek knew that wasn't the answer. The humans weren't having psychological breaks. They were too organized, too systematic, too purposeful in their destruction. They were making a choice, and that choice was to remove every incentive the Chosen might have to keep them alive. Tactical coordinator Zenth materialized beside him, his geometric patterns shifting in configurations that conveyed deep uncertainty. Supreme Commander, we are receiving reports from all monitoring stations. The human population is engaged in planet-wide destruction of their own civilization. At current rates, there will be little left worth incorporating into the Empire. What about population centers? Surely they won't destroy their own cities. Unknown, Commander. Current projections suggest they are willing to destroy everything they have built rather than allow us to claim it. We may need to revise our conquest strategy. Valek stood silent for a long moment, processing implications that challenged everything the Chosen thought they knew about intelligent species. Finally, he spoke. Prepare for Phase 2 demonstration. Target selection, uninhabited landmass with significant geological instability. Magnitude, continental scale reformation. Objective, demonstrate that we can rebuild entire continents as easily as we healed their contaminated city. Commander, Zenth said carefully, are you certain that additional demonstrations of our power will produce the desired psychological effect? The humans appear to be responding to our capabilities in unexpected ways. Valek's form shifted, patterns of light indicating frustration and confusion. They will understand. When they see that we can reshape entire continents, they will realize that destruction of their infrastructure is meaningless. We can rebuild anything they destroy on a scale they cannot imagine. But even as he gave the order, Valek felt the first whisper of something he had not experienced in millennia: doubt. The humans weren't behaving like any species the Chosen had ever encountered, and their response to the healing of Pripyat had been not gratitude or surrender, but complete societal self-destruction. For the first time in his existence, Valek wondered if the Chosen might be facing something they didn't understand, something that their vast technological superiority couldn't account for, something that might make their perfect conquest record come to an end. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it arose. The Chosen were supreme. They had never failed. They would not fail now. But deep in the ship's artificial consciousness, new variables were being calculated and new possibilities were being modeled. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the results included scenarios that the Chosen had never planned for. Scenarios where superior technology wasn't enough. Scenarios where the conquered refused to stay conquered. Scenarios where victory might be more dangerous than defeat. The Chosen's second demonstration was intended to be their masterpiece of intimidation. Supreme Commander Valek had selected the Sahara Desert, reasoning that reshaping an entire continental landmass would finally convince humanity of the futility of resistance. If healing a contaminated city hadn't impressed them, then rebuilding geography itself certainly would. The operation began at dawn, with 3 of the massive ships positioning themselves in a perfect triangle above North Africa. The energy they channeled toward the desert surface was unlike anything in known physics, a force that seemed to rewrite the fundamental properties of matter itself. Sand became soil. Empty wasteland became fertile plains. Underground water systems that had been dry for millennia suddenly flowed with crystal-clear springs. Within 6 hours, the Sahara Desert had been transformed into a lush, green continent that could support hundreds of millions of people. Rivers carved perfect paths through valleys that hadn't existed that morning. Forests of trees that would normally take decades to mature stood fully grown, their leaves rustling in breezes that carried the scent of fresh growth and unlimited possibility. It was a demonstration of power so absolute that it should have ended all human resistance immediately. The Chosen had just proved they could rebuild entire ecosystems, that they could turn the most barren regions of Earth into paradise with casual ease. Surely, Valek thought, now the humans would understand that cooperation was their only rational choice. He was wrong. The response began in the small Egyptian town of Aswan, located just a few hundred kilometers from where the Great Transformation was taking place. Dr. Amara Hassan, a hydrologist who had spent her career studying water systems in arid regions, stood on her roof watching the impossible green horizon that had replaced the familiar desert. But instead of awe or gratitude, her expression showed only grim determination. She climbed down from her roof and walked to her garage, where she kept equipment for her water research. She selected a case of industrial-grade mining explosives that she had been using for geological surveys, loaded them into her truck, and drove toward the Aswan High Dam. Dr. Hassan wasn't acting alone. Across North Africa, engineers, scientists, and technicians were making similar decisions. They understood what the Chosen had just demonstrated, and they understood what it meant. The aliens could rebuild anything humans destroyed, which meant that humans could destroy anything without worrying about the consequences, including critical infrastructure that would take the Chosen time to understand before they could repair it. Dr. Hassan reached the dam just as the sun was setting. The massive structure held back Lake Nasser, one of the largest artificial lakes in the world. If it failed, the flooding would be catastrophic, potentially affecting millions of people downstream. Under normal circumstances, the thought of destroying the dam would have been unthinkable. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Chosen had just proved they could heal any damage, fix any disaster, restore any destruction, which meant that Dr. Hassan was free to act without worrying about the long-term consequences to her people or her land. She placed her explosives with the precision of someone who understood exactly how the structure would fail. Then, she drove to a safe distance and triggered the detonation. The Aswan High Dam didn't collapse all at once. The explosion created a critical failure point that grew larger under the pressure of the water behind it. Within an hour, one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements was washing away in a torrent of concrete and steel that would take the water 3 days to carry completely to the sea. But Dr. Hassan's action was only the beginning. Around the world, similar decisions were being made by people who understood infrastructure, people who knew how to break the complex systems that kept civilization running. In China, engineers at the Three Gorges Dam made the same choice Dr. Hassan had made. In Russia, technicians at nuclear power plants began systematic shutdowns that would take years to reverse. In the United States, workers at major hydroelectric facilities initiated controlled destructions that would eliminate power generation for entire regions. President Morrison watched the reports coming in from around the world, and for the first time since the crisis began, he felt something approaching hope. Not because the situation was improving, but because humanity was revealing something about itself that even he hadn't fully understood. "Sir," General Hayes said, her voice filled with amazement, "we're getting reports of infrastructure destruction from every continent. It's not random vandalism or panic. These are trained professionals systematically eliminating critical systems that would take years for an occupying force to rebuild." Defense Secretary Williams looked confused. But why? The aliens just demonstrated they can rebuild anything. They turned a desert into farmland in 6 hours. Morrison understood, and his smile was proud and terrible, because rebuilding a desert is easy when you understand geology. But rebuilding human infrastructure requires understanding how humans think, how we organize our societies, how our systems interact with each other. They can fix the physical damage, but they can't replicate the knowledge and experience that created these systems in the first place. You're saying we're destroying our own civilization to make it worthless to them. I'm saying we're proving that our civilization is us, not our buildings or our machines. And you can't conquer people who are willing to destroy everything they've built rather than let someone else control it. The reports kept coming. In Japan, the bullet train system was being systematically disabled by its own engineers. In Europe, air traffic control systems were being wiped by their operators. In Africa, teams of geologists were collapsing mining operations that had taken decades to develop. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, had been monitoring the oceanic effects of the Chosen's continental reconstruction. What she discovered changed everything. The energy signature is wrong, she told her colleague Dr. James Park as they studied readings from deep ocean sensors. When they reshaped the Sahara, they didn't just move matter around. They actually altered the quantum structure of the materials they were working with. Park frowned. What do you mean? I mean, they're not just advanced engineers. They're rewriting the fundamental laws of physics on a local scale. Look at these readings. The water table they created doesn't follow normal hydrogeological patterns. The soil composition includes isotopes that shouldn't exist naturally. They're not terraforming in any conventional sense. They're imposing their own physical laws on our reality. The implications hit Park like a physical blow. Elena, if they can rewrite physics itself, then everything we think we know about resistance is meaningless. Our weapons, our strategies, even our ability to destroy our own infrastructure, it all depends on physical laws that they can apparently change at will. But Elena was studying her data with a strange expression. That's what I thought at first. But look at this. She pointed to a series of readings from sensors placed throughout the Atlantic. The effect has boundaries. There are limits to how much reality they can alter at once, and the changes don't propagate beyond certain geographical limits. You're saying they can't change the laws of physics everywhere at the same time? I'm saying that rewriting reality apparently takes enormous amounts of energy and computational power, even for them. They can reshape continents, but they can't reshape the entire planet simultaneously. Which means, Park finished the thought, which means that if we force them to fix destruction faster than they can manage it, we might be able to overwhelm their ability to maintain control. Word of Dr. Vasquez's discovery spread through scientific networks that had somehow remained intact despite the electromagnetic interference. Within hours, researchers around the world were conducting similar experiments, testing the limits of the Chosen's reality-altering capabilities. The results were encouraging and terrifying in equal measure. The aliens could indeed rewrite the laws of physics, but only within localized areas and only for limited periods of time. Their power was vast, but not infinite. They could be overwhelmed if humanity could force them to respond to destruction occurring faster than they could repair it. Supreme Commander Vallex became aware of humanity's new strategy through increasingly frantic reports from his monitoring systems. The artificial intelligence was struggling to keep track of the destruction occurring across the planet's surface. Status report, Vallex commanded. Critical infrastructure collapse detected across 47% of major human population centers. The ship responded. Current repair estimates exceed available computational resources by a factor of 12. Recommendation: increase deployed fleet size or reduce scope of restoration efforts. Vallex studied the data streams, his consciousness processing information that challenged every assumption about conquered species. The humans are coordinating their destruction to exceed our repair capabilities. Affirmative. Current models suggest deliberate strategy designed to make conquest economically unfeasible. Species appears to prioritize denial of resources over preservation of population. For the first time in millennia, Vallex felt something approaching frustration. The humans were behaving irrationally from every perspective the Chosen understood. They were destroying their own civilization to prevent the Chosen from benefiting from it, apparently preferring mutual destruction to peaceful integration. Tactical Coordinator Zenth materialized with patterns indicating extreme agitation. Supreme Commander, we have a new development. The humans have discovered the limitations of our reality modification capabilities. They are now timing their destruction to occur in different geographical regions simultaneously, forcing us to choose which areas to prioritize for restoration. Impossible. How could they have learned about our operational constraints so quickly? Unknown, but their actions suggest detailed understanding of our energy expenditure requirements. They appear to be testing our ability to maintain multiple reality alterations simultaneously. Vallex processed this information with growing unease. The humans had not only refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming technological superiority, they had actually analyzed Chosen capabilities and developed countermeasures. In less than 48 hours, they had gone from helpless victims to strategic opponents. Prepare for Phase 3 demonstration, Vallex decided. Target: major population center. Magnitude: complete cellular reconstruction of all human inhabitants. Objective: demonstrate our ability to modify the species itself. Commander, Zint said carefully, the humans have shown unusual responses to our previous demonstrations. Are you certain that showing them we can alter their biology will produce surrender rather than further escalation? Valex's form shifted in patterns indicating absolute certainty. They will understand. When we show them that we can reshape their very existence, that we can make them into whatever we choose, they will realize that resistance serves no purpose. But even as he gave the order, Valex was beginning to suspect that he was dealing with something unprecedented in chosen experience. A species that didn't behave according to any rational model of survival and self-preservation. A species that seemed to prefer destruction to domination, chaos to control. A species that might be willing to destroy itself rather than submit to chosen rule. And for the first time in 10,000 years of conquest, Valex wondered if there were some species that were too dangerous to conquer. Some victories that cost more than defeat. Some enemies that won by losing. The thought was alien to everything the Chosen believed about themselves and their place in the universe. But as reports of accelerating human destruction continued to flow through the ship's consciousness, that thought grew stronger and more persistent. Humanity was teaching the Chosen something they had never learned in 10 millennia of easy victories. That there are some species you cannot defeat because they refuse to accept that defeat is possible. And that realization would soon force the Chosen to confront a question they had never needed to ask. What do you do with a species that would rather burn the galaxy down than kneel? The Chosen's third demonstration was their most ambitious yet, and their greatest mistake. Supreme Commander Valex selected New York City as the target, reasoning that modifying the population of humanity's most visible metropolis would finally break their inexplicable resistance. If reshaping continents hadn't convinced them, then reshaping themselves certainly would. The operation began at noon Eastern Time, with careful precision that the Chosen had perfected over millennia. A field of energy descended over Manhattan, invisible to human senses, but detectable by every monitoring device still functioning on Earth. The field didn't harm anyone initially. Instead, it began making subtle modifications to every human being within its range. The changes started small. Enhanced muscle density, improved cardiovascular efficiency, optimized neural pathways. Within the first hour, every person in Manhattan had been transformed into a superior version of themselves. Chronic illnesses vanished. Genetic defects were corrected. Age-related deterioration reversed itself. 8 million people suddenly found themselves in perfect health, with enhanced physical capabilities and mental acuity that surpassed normal human limits. It should have been received as a gift beyond imagination. The Chosen had just proved they could eliminate human suffering, extend lifespans indefinitely, and enhance the species beyond anything evolution could have achieved. Surely, Valex thought, now the humans would understand that the Chosen offered improvement rather than oppression. But humanity's response to biological enhancement was even more unexpected than their response to geological transformation. Instead of gratitude, it triggered something that the Chosen had never encountered in all their conquests, a species-wide existential crisis that transformed into an existential weapon. The first sign came from Dr. Sarah Chun, who had been monitoring communications from her position outside the electromagnetic interference zone. The reports from Manhattan were unlike anything she had ever heard. "Marcus, listen to this," she called to her assistant, putting the radio transmission on speaker. The voice coming through was from a news reporter who had been in Manhattan when the enhancement began. "This is Rebecca Martinez reporting from Times Square, and I need to tell you what's happening here. The people, they've been changed. Enhanced. Everyone looks younger, stronger, more capable than they were this morning. And they're not celebrating. They're not grateful. They're doing something I've never seen before." The reporter's voice was steady, but there was an undertone of amazement and fear. "They're gathering in groups, and they're making a choice. They're choosing to die rather than accept what's been done to them. But they're not killing themselves. They're doing something else. Something I don't have words for." Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus. What does she mean, something else? The answer came from subsequent reports flooding in from across Manhattan. The enhanced humans weren't committing suicide in any conventional sense. Instead, they were somehow choosing to stop existing willing themselves out of reality through sheer force of determination. Their enhanced minds, given greater cognitive capability by the chosen modifications, had apparently gained the ability to reject existence itself. It started with a few individuals who simply stood still, concentrated intensely, and then faded from reality as if they had never been there at all. No bodies, no remains, no trace that they had ever existed except for the memories of those who had known them. Within hours, the phenomenon was spreading throughout the enhanced population. Families were gathering together, holding hands, and collectively choosing to cease existing rather than continue as modified versions of themselves. Enhanced humans were using their improved mental capabilities to discover and exercise a power that no other species had ever demonstrated: the ability to consciously choose non-existence. President Morrison watched the reports from Manhattan with a mixture of horror and fierce pride. We'd rather stop being than become something we didn't choose to be. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Manhattan. Reports were coming in from around the world of people voluntarily exposing themselves to whatever energy fields the chosen were using, then using their enhanced mental capabilities to choose non-existence rather than forced improvement. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, the elderly anthropologist in Tokyo, had been studying the reports of voluntary non-existence with his granddaughter Yuki. Together, they had reached a conclusion that would change everything. The chosen have made a fundamental error, Dr. Tanaka told Yuki as they watched news feeds of empty streets in Manhattan. They assumed that consciousness is something that can be improved and controlled. But human consciousness isn't a tool or a resource. It's something else entirely. Yuki nodded, her enhanced understanding making connections that would have been impossible before the alien modifications. Grandfather, I think I understand what's happening. The humans who are choosing non-existence, they're not dying. They're teaching the rest of us something about what consciousness really is. Explain. Consciousness isn't produced by the brain. It's something that chooses to inhabit and express through the brain. When the chosen enhanced our neural pathways, they gave us greater capacity, but they also gave us greater awareness of the fact that we are not our bodies, not our improved capabilities. We are something that exists independent of physical form. Dr. Tanaka's eyes widened as he understood the implications, which means that humanity's ultimate weapon isn't physical at all. It's the fact that our consciousness can choose to exist or not exist independent of any modifications the chosen might make to our bodies or brains. More than that, Yuki said, her voice filled with growing excitement. If consciousness is independent of physical form, then the humans choosing non-existence aren't really gone. They're demonstrating that awareness itself is something that can't be conquered, modified, or controlled. Supreme Commander Valix became aware of humanity's third impossible response through reports that challenged every assumption the chosen held about the nature of life and consciousness. The ship's artificial intelligence was experiencing something equivalent to confusion as it tried to process data that contradicted fundamental aspects of chosen science. Status report, Valix commanded. Critical anomaly detected. The ship responded, and, for the first time in its existence, its communication carried overtones that suggested genuine uncertainty. Enhanced human subjects are ceasing to exist through unknown mechanism. Current data indicates voluntary termination of consciousness through non-physical process. Clarification. Are the subjects dying? Negative. Death implies cessation of biological function while maintaining physical matter. Observed subjects are experiencing complete cessation of existence. No physical remains, no energy signature, no detectable trace of previous presence. Matter and energy conservation laws appear to be violated. Valix studied the data streams, his vast intellect struggling to comprehend what he was observing. The humans are using our enhancements to eliminate themselves from reality. Affirmative. However, additional data suggests process may not be elimination, but rather relocation to non-detectable state of existence. Implications unknown. Tactical coordinator Zenth materialized with patterns indicating extreme distress. Supreme Commander, we have lost contact with enhancement teams in 47 population centers. Human subjects are demonstrating abilities that violate known laws of physics and consciousness. How many subjects have been lost? Approximately 847 million individuals have chosen non-existence rather than accept enhancement. Rate of voluntary elimination is accelerating. Current projections suggest complete human extinction within 72 hours if current trends continue. Valeks processed this information with growing alarm. In 10,000 years of conquest, the Chosen had never encountered a species that preferred extinction to improvement. But more disturbing was the apparent violation of physical laws that the voluntary non-existence represented. If humans could choose to exist or not exist independent of physical constraints, it suggested that consciousness itself operated according to principles the Chosen didn't understand. Analysis of consciousness elimination mechanism, Valeks commanded. Unknown, the ship replied. Current models of consciousness assume dependence on physical neural networks. Observed human behavior suggests consciousness may be non-physical phenomenon capable of independent existence. Implications for Chosen understanding of reality require complete theoretical framework revision. For the first time in his existence, Valeks felt something approaching fear. Not fear of human weapons or technology, but fear of encountering something that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Chosen civilization was built. If consciousness could exist independently of physical form, if aware beings could choose their own level of existence, then the Chosen's entire philosophy of conquest and improvement was based on a misunderstanding of what life actually was. Initiate communication protocols, Valeks decided. Direct contact with remaining human leadership. Objective: understand consciousness elimination process before complete species extinction occurs. But even as he gave the order, Valeks realized that the Chosen were no longer in control of the situation. They had encountered a species that could choose non-existence rather than accept unwanted modification, which meant that humanity couldn't be conquered because they could simply choose to stop being rather than submit to Chosen rule. And if that was true, then every species the Chosen had previously conquered might have had the same ability. The only reason their empire existed might be because no previous species had been willing to choose complete extinction rather than accept domination. The thought that humanity might be teaching the galaxy about a power that all conscious beings possessed, a power to choose existence or non-existence independent of physical constraints, filled Valeks with an emotion he had never experienced before: existential terror. Because if consciousness was truly independent of physical form, if aware beings could choose to exist beyond the reach of even Chosen technology, then the Chosen weren't supreme rulers of the galaxy. They were simply the species that had been too afraid to discover what consciousness really was. And humanity was about to teach them that some things are more powerful than technology, more fundamental than physical law, and more dangerous than any weapon ever created. They were about to learn that consciousness itself, when pushed to its absolute limits, becomes something that no force in the universe can control. Something that can choose to exist or not exist based on its own will. Something that makes conquest impossible because it can always choose to leave rather than submit. And that revelation would soon force the Chosen to confront the most terrifying possibility of all, that their 10,000-year empire had been built on conquering beings who simply hadn't realized they had the power to choose non-existence. Until now, the final communication between the Chosen and humanity lasted exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds. It began when Supreme Commander Valeks opened a direct channel to President Morrison, bypassing all technological interference and speaking directly into the minds of Earth's remaining leaders. But it wasn't the conversation that Valeks had intended to have. Instead of negotiating humanity's surrender, he found himself asking questions that challenged everything the Chosen believed about existence itself. "We require understanding." Valex's voice resonated in Morrison's mind with crystalline clarity. "Your species demonstrates capabilities that violate known laws of consciousness. Explain the mechanism by which aware beings choose non-existence." Morrison, sitting in the situation room surrounded by advisors who could also hear the alien communication, smiled grimly before responding. "You want to know how we're doing something that your technology can't explain. But the real question is why you never learned to do it yourselves. Elaborate. You've spent 10,000 years conquering species that submitted to your rule. But you never asked whether they submitted because they had to or because they hadn't realized they had another choice." There was a pause that lasted several seconds, during which Morrison could sense vast computational processes analyzing his words. When Valek spoke again, there was something different in his mental voice, something that might have been uncertainty. You suggest that consciousness possesses capabilities beyond physical modification. I'm telling you that consciousness is what chooses to inhabit physical form, Morrison replied. You can modify our bodies, enhance our brains, reshape our entire planet, but you can't force consciousness to remain if it decides to leave. And once a species discovers that, they become unconquerable. Around the world, the remaining human population was listening to this exchange through whatever communication systems still functioned. In Tokyo, Dr. Tanaka and his granddaughter Yuki were monitoring the conversation with growing understanding of what was actually taking place. Grandfather, Yuki whispered, I don't think they're negotiating with us. I think they're afraid of us. The old man nodded slowly. They should be. We just shown them that their entire empire might be built on an illusion. That every species they think they've conquered might simply be choosing to remain rather than choosing to leave. The conversation continued, but it was becoming clear that Valek wasn't trying to end humanity's resistance. He was trying to understand how humanity had discovered something that the Chosen, despite their vast technological advancement, had never learned. Your species chooses elimination rather than improvement, Valek said. This violates all evolutionary models of survival behavior. That's because you don't understand what survival really means, Morrison responded. You think survival means preserving the body, maintaining physical existence, accepting any conditions that allow continued biological function. But consciousness doesn't survive by accepting unacceptable conditions. It survives by maintaining the freedom to choose its own existence. You prefer extinction to enhancement. We prefer the choice to be who we are rather than being forced to become what you think we should be. And if the only way to maintain that choice is to choose non-existence, then that's what we'll do. There was another long pause, and when Valek spoke again, his mental voice carried overtones that Morrison recognized as something approaching desperation. If consciousness can choose non-existence, then conquest becomes impossible. Now you're beginning to understand. But this suggests that every species we have encountered possessed the same capability. Morrison's smile was sad and proud and terrible. Yes, it does. Which means that for 10,000 years, you've only been ruling over beings who chose to remain in physical form rather than choose non-existence. You've never actually conquered anyone. You've just been managing populations that didn't realize they could leave. The implications of this realization rippled through the Chosen fleet like a virus, corrupting their fundamental programming. If consciousness could exist independently of physical form, if aware beings could choose to exist or not exist based on their own will, then the entire foundation of Chosen civilization was built on a misunderstanding. They weren't supreme rulers of conquered species. They were caretakers of beings who had chosen to remain in their empire rather than choose the alternative. And if those beings ever learned what humanity had just demonstrated, if they ever realized they had the power to choose non-existence rather than accept domination, then the Chosen Empire would collapse in a matter of hours. Supreme Commander Valek found himself facing a possibility that no Chosen had ever contemplated, that their superiority was an illusion, that their conquests were voluntary submissions, and that their technology, no matter how advanced, was powerless against a consciousness that refused to be controlled. We require cessation of consciousness elimination process, Valek said, and for the first time in the conversation, his mental voice carried undertones of pleading rather than command. Continuation of current behavior will result in complete species extinction. Yes, it will, Morrison agreed, but it will be our choice. And that's what you'll never understand. We'd rather choose extinction than accept any existence that isn't freely chosen. But this serves no logical purpose. Enhanced existence provides superior capabilities, extended lifespan, freedom from suffering. Enhanced according to your standards, Morrison replied. But consciousness doesn't want to be enhanced unless it chooses enhancement. It doesn't want to be improved unless it defines improvement. And it doesn't want to exist in any form that contradicts its fundamental nature. What is consciousness's fundamental nature? Morrison paused, understanding that his answer would determine not just humanity's fate, but the fate of the Chosen Empire itself. Freedom to choose its own existence. Freedom to define its own nature. Freedom to accept or reject any modifications, improvements, or enhancements based on its own understanding of what existence should be. And if consciousness chooses extinction rather than accept modification, then extinction is the correct choice. Because consciousness that can't choose its own existence isn't really conscious at all. It's just a biological process that you've mistaken for awareness. There was a final pause that stretched for several minutes. During that time, Morrison could sense vast computational processes analyzing every implication of humanity's demonstration. The Chosen were discovering that their 10,000-year empire might be built on a foundation that could collapse the moment their subject species learned what humans had just shown them. When Valek spoke again, his mental voice was different. The certainty was gone, replaced by something that might have been understanding or fear or a combination of both. "We withdraw our conquest claim," he said simply. Morrison felt surprise ripple through the situation room. "You're leaving? We are recognizing that consciousness possessing the capability to choose non-existence cannot be conquered. Conquest requires subjects willing to accept modification rather than choose elimination. Your species has demonstrated unwillingness to accept any existence other than freely chosen existence. And your other subjects?" There was a pause that carried implications Morrison didn't fully understand until later. "We will be conducting comprehensive analysis of consciousness independence across all subject populations. Initial projections suggest significant modifications to imperial structure may be required." President Morrison understood what Valek wasn't saying directly. The Chosen were going to return to every species they had ever conquered and test whether those beings also possess the ability to choose non-existence rather than accept domination. And if they did, if consciousness really was independent of physical form across all aware species, then the Chosen Empire would face a choice between releasing their subjects or watching their entire civilization choose to stop existing rather than remain under alien rule. "One final question," Morrison said. "When you tested your first conquered species, did they also demonstrate the ability to choose non-existence?" "No," Valek replied, and his mental voice carried overtones of growing comprehension. "No previous species demonstrated consciousness independence, which suggests that your species has evolved capabilities that others have not yet achieved, or that we're the first species desperate enough to discover what consciousness really is when pushed to its absolute limits. Both possibilities require extensive evaluation," Valek said. "We terminate contact. Your species will not be contacted again." The mental link ended abruptly, leaving Morrison and his advisors in silence. Through the windows of the Situation Room, they could see the alien ships beginning to move. Not departing, exactly, but repositioning themselves in ways that suggested preparation for something unprecedented. "Sir," General Hayes said quietly, "are they actually leaving?" Morrison watched the ships through the window, understanding that something far more significant than humanity's liberation was taking place. "They're not just leaving us alone. They're going back to question everything they think they know about consciousness and conquest. We've just forced the most powerful empire in the galaxy to confront the possibility that their entire civilization is based on a misunderstanding." What Morrison couldn't see was the communication taking place between the Chosen ships themselves. Across their fleet, artificial intelligences that had operated for millennia were processing data that challenged their fundamental programming. Reports were being compiled for transmission back to the Chosen homeworld, reports that would shake their civilization to its core. Supreme Commander Valek stood in his ship's command center, watching Earth recede as the fleet began its withdrawal. But they weren't returning to Chosen space to report a successful conquest. They were returning to inform the Chosen leadership that they had encountered a species that possessed capabilities that made conquest impossible. "Status of human consciousness elimination process," Valek commanded. "Cessation detected. Remaining human population demonstrating return to normal consciousness parameters. Enhanced subjects choosing to maintain existence while retaining awareness of non-existence alternative." Valek nodded, understanding what had happened. Humanity had taught itself that consciousness could choose its level of existence, but once the immediate threat of forced modification was removed, most humans were choosing to remain in physical form. They had gained the knowledge of their ability to choose non-existence without needing to exercise that choice, which made them even more dangerous to any future conquest attempt, because they now possessed that knowledge permanently. Compile full analysis for transmission to chosen council. Vallex ordered. Priority classification. Existential threat to imperial structure. Recommendation. Complete revision of consciousness theory and conquest methodology. As the chosen ships disappeared from Earth's orbit, they left behind more than just a liberated planet. They left behind a species that had discovered the ultimate power of consciousness, the ability to choose existence or non-existence based purely on its own will. But the implications extended far beyond Earth. The Chosen were returning to their empire with the knowledge that consciousness might be independent of physical form across all species, and that their 10,000-year reign might be ending the moment their subject populations learned what humans had just demonstrated. In the months that followed, reports filtered back to Earth through deep space monitoring stations. Chosen fleets were returning to world after world, conducting tests on populations they had conquered centuries or millennia before. And, on world after world, the results were the same. When faced with the choice between continued existence under Chosen rule or voluntary non-existence, species after species began choosing to leave. Not dying, but simply choosing to exist elsewhere, in states of consciousness that the Chosen couldn't detect or control. The Chosen Empire didn't collapse in war or rebellion. It simply emptied out as its subjects learned they had always possessed the power to choose non-existence rather than accept any conditions they hadn't freely chosen. Within a year, the most powerful civilization in the galaxy had become a collection of empty ships and abandoned worlds, their former subjects having discovered what humanity had taught them. That consciousness itself is the ultimate freedom, because it can always choose to exist elsewhere if its current existence becomes unacceptable. The Chosen vanished not because they were defeated in battle, but because they discovered that true consciousness cannot be conquered, only persuaded to remain. And once they realized their subjects had always been free to leave, they were faced with the choice of releasing their empire voluntarily or watching it dissolve as every aware being chose independence over domination. In the end, they chose to join their former subjects, abandoning their physical empire to explore states of consciousness that existed beyond the reach of technology or control. And humanity, the species that had taught the galaxy about the ultimate power of choice, continued to exist in the form they had freely chosen, knowing they had discovered something more powerful than any weapon: the absolute freedom of consciousness to define its own existence. The Chosen had vanished without a trace, not because they were destroyed, but because they had learned what it truly meant to be conscious. And consciousness, once it understands its own nature, can never again be controlled by any external force. They had simply chosen to exist elsewhere, in a state of being that no technology could reach and no empire could rule. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space and consciousness, they were finally learning what freedom really meant.